Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our lovely Rasmussen Theatre. My name is Xelaltxw, and I work in the Museum Programs Department here. This is our first Living Earth program we've done since 2019, so we're glad to be back live. And today, the next one will be bringing life back to our beaches, the resurgence of Coast Salish sea gardens. Sea gardens, shell gardens, or clam gardens, as it is also known by it's a tradition that has been practiced in the Northwest Coast for several thousand years and has been enjoying a huge resurgence over the last couple of years. And we're very lucky to have with us today one of the premier experts, Nicole Norris. She is Coast Salish, First Nations from Canada. She's a founding member of the Lands and Resource Society, an Indigenous Planning Officer for the Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness, First Nations intergovernmental communicator, an aquaculture specialist expert, and cultural safety facilitator. So let's give a warm welcome to Nicole.
This saves on my throat a little bit. So as Hayes mentioned, I am Canadian. I come from the Halalt First Nation, which is nestled in the heart of the Hul'q'umi'num territory. That makes me Coast Salish. I have relatives all the way from Hul'q'umi'num, which is a small township on Vancouver Island, all the way into California. I wear many hats. As Hayes mentioned, I'm a founding member of the Hul'q'umi'num Lands and Resource Society, very treasured member of Halalt. I'm a knowledge holder. I'm an aquaculture specialist. I work in emergency management and intergovernmental communication. But the most important title that I hold is a descendant. I'm a very treasured descendant of a gentleman by the name of Xelaltxw. Xelaltxw is one of the first four that fell from the sky that created the Salish. The stories about him, they talk about how he was in these spaces. They talk about the care that he provided for the lands and the resources. I feel very privileged to be able to participate in the same spaces. So the grander story about the sea gardens, there was this gentleman and he was doing a shoreline survey, and he was in this tiny plane and he's flying down the coast of Vancouver Island, and he looked off down towards the beach and he's seen these rock-walled structures. So he swooped around in his plane and took some pictures. He went back to his colleagues at the university, and for 3 years they sat around daydreaming about what these structures could be. And somebody leaned into the conversation and said, "Why don't you ask the local natives that are around here? They might know." A couple of years later, there's a lady, a treasured loved one of mine. Her name is Kathleen Johnny. She was chasing me down in a parking lot and she says, "Excuse me, "Are you the clam queen?" And I turned around and I laughed and I said, "Geez, I haven't been called that in years." I'm the first lady from my nation to take aquaculture as far as I did, based on the nursery rhyme, "She sells seashells by the seashore." Anyway, so she says, "Yeah," she says, "we're in the boardroom here in the office and there's a table full of fisheries people and your name keeps coming up." I said, "Oh, geez." Thinking back to those old school fisheries days, I was the only lady and I was the smallest one and my rain gear didn't fit and the guys would always tease me about being slow. So I walked into the boardroom and there they all were. And my very good friend, Bruce Thomas, points at the whiteboard. And he doesn't say anything to me, he just points at the whiteboard. And I turned and I looked. I said, "Oh, for heaven's sakes, I know what these are." And I walked over to the whiteboard and grabbed one of those markers. I said, "Here's how you build them." And I started talking about water flow, and I started talking about species and ways that we interact. And he turns and says to me, "I knew that you would know something about this." I learned about these particular rock walls when I was in the Klahoose territory. There was an elder there, his name, he's since passed away, but his name was Einar PL. And when I was the aquaculture manager, he said to me, I was very young, he says to me, let's go on a bit of an adventure. I said, "Okay." And he brings me out into the cove. It was cold. We're waiting for the tide to go out, and he starts building these rocks. And he created this wall, and he says, "We're just going to sit here and wait. We're going to be here for a while." And the tide came in, and we were there. And the tide went out, and there was an octopus behind that wall. And I caught on. So I shared the story with this group. A handful of moments later, I'm buying rain gear once again. I thought for sure that once I had moved into consulting that I had given up field work. And we began to engage in these spaces that my ancestors had originally been. There's a tiny little island off the coast of Vancouver Island, and it's called Saturna Island. It has a place known as Winter Cove. It's a particularly special place for me. Through Western science, we have discovered that these rock walls are at least 4,000 years old. What they do is they create an opportunity for attraction of sea life. I often describe them as metropolitan cities for aquatic life. One of the things as Indigenous people, Indigenous knowledge comes from generational observation, comes from mutual respect and care for the spaces. When I talk about clam gardens, I always talk about it from the viewpoint of one single clam. That one single clam is also eaten by our relatives of the sea. That same clam is eaten by our relatives in the woods. So when we care for these spaces, we understand that it's not just about us. When the other relatives of the sea are nourished and the other relatives of the woods are nourished, it's balanced because we too eat from the sea and we too eat from the woods. One of the things that's really critical about our interaction in these spaces, more specifically the things that I think about and the things that I teach, is about that long-standing history. When I take off my boots and my socks and I stand with my feet nestled into the sand, I'm standing in the footprints of Xelaltxw. when I walk to that wall and I grab those rocks that we know are 4,000 years old, and I hold that rock ever so carefully in my hand, that is the handprint of Xelaltxw. When I eat these clams, that's the same ingredient that he ate. For First Nations people, it is that cellular memory that gives us that lens of stewardship and care. We have an ingrained sense of need to care for these spaces. I'm sure that we all know about colonization and various sectors of government. Well, in Canada, more particularly in BC, the federal government came in and they drew this is the way I describe it, they drew an imaginary circle around the Gulf Islands. The Gulf Islands is the spaces in which we had intertribal trade. The Gulf Islands is also where we used to bring our most treasured deceased loved ones, our highest esteemed chiefs. And through a very demonstrated act of reconciliation, Parks Canada opened the door and said, please come and teach us about these spaces. When we began to interact with these beaches, originally we used potato rakes to dig into the ground. And I remember the first tide that we went there and I dug into the ground and it was so dense. It was like concrete. It was so hard. The amount of rocks that was inside the substrate made it difficult to get the fork into the ground. And I looked up, and at the time there was different players from Parks Canada. We had a gentleman by the name of Nathan Cardinal, and I looked up at him and I said, you see, this is why we need to be here. Life took a long time to come back. You'll see from our booth, we have a splicing of videos, and now you can see the spitting of the clams in that space. One of the reasons why we're very adamant about being in the space and interacting with that landscape, we own the copyright of that architecture, of that rock wall. But the primary reason is because of food security. In the eye of climate change, we just came through a pandemic. That was something, hey? That toilet paper shortage that we had, that was really something. And then there was a China lily shortage. That was, people were paying $20 for a bottle of soy sauce. Anyway, not gonna lie, I probably would have too, it's my favorite. But, so when we look at traditional diets, we look at First Nations health. They're the most important people to me, more particularly the membership of Halalt. It's important to me that my great-grandchildren will be able to go in the same space and eat the same things that I eat. With climate change, ocean health is directly related to climate change. And if our ocean is unwell, we are seeing crazy things. Massive floods and massive fires, drought. Our cedars are dying. They are the most thirsty trees in the woods. And because of drought, they're dying. They become dehydrated, they become matchsticks. And then we have a heat dome. So by us interacting with these spaces, restoring that wall, it's a ripple effect of care. We're increasing the biomass. We're increasing the biodiversity. There's more than just clams that are there. We're increasing the opportunity for food for regular day eating, social and ceremonial purposes. First Nations people, my people in particular, are very ingrained in ceremony. It's one of the things that I say to all the university students that come out there with all their instruments in Parks Canada. You know, I always say culture first. You announce yourself to the ancestors because this is where they live. Let them know that we're just here in a good way. Food security is paramount to First Nations, especially to us. It's an intimate relationship that we have, and we have this epidemic of diabetes and other health-related problems, heart problems. And it's because of the disconnect from our traditional diet. Some colleagues from the Greater Pacific, we were talking about it at lunch. And I said, you know, what's really interesting, I'm an identified Indigenous leader of the Pacific, and I've traveled around helping our other collective relatives along the Pacific engage in their aquatic spaces, and how nourished I felt when I ate from the sea. It's the same water. Reconciliation is important. We create a reconciliated opportunity for ourselves when we engage in these spaces. The original relationship for the Coast Salish was with this land and was with these spaces, was with those ingredients of that traditional diet. The relationship that we have with Parks Canada is unique. It is the first federal agency that has put down their Western science instruments and said, no, you teach us. This is your space, this is your ancestral lands, and we respect the fact that you've taken up the opportunity to invite us here. They provide us with the boats and the gas. They bring lawn chairs. For me, it's work. For them, it's like a like a camp out. We stay there for days on end. We've been doing this work on these beaches for well over a decade now. And I was just out there in the summertime, and I had said, okay, that's enough. I want the federal government to just surrender to me now. I want the whole beach. Originally, they had this line. They were doing a test, because sometimes we need to prove things before we'll be allowed to carry on. And what we've discovered is that it's true when we interact with these spaces that they're revived. And so now we're moving in towards an opportunity for seeding. We're going to turn them into actual farming grounds so that we have a consistent turnover. The other thing that we're facing, aside from acidification of the ocean and microplastics, we've just discovered microplastics at our clam gardens, but also the competition for traffic, water traffic. We have a tremendous amount of ferries and tankers in our territory. And so contamination is a big piece. Bivalve testing is a big piece. It's bigger conversations that we're having in all sorts of spaces. I'm privileged to be an identified Indigenous leader of the Pacific because I'm able to bring these conversations into spaces that help other Indigenous people from the other side of the world. There was a lady that I met during the Impact 5 Congress, and she said to me, Nicole, I've heard of you, and I've heard of your work. I heard that you say prayers before you do your work. And she says, I really want to come to your clam garden. I want to see what you do there. And she says, one of the things that I think about most is when I step into the water, that there's a possibility you may be standing in the same water, and we are sisters in common, taking care of these spaces together. And that was a really profound moment for me. What it showed me is that I'm not the only one that's concerned. I'm not the only one that's working and trying. I'm not the only one it matters to. Culturally speaking, you hear a lot of our leadership, they talk about how we're borrowing the land and these resources from our great-great-grandchildren. And it's true. The things that we're doing in these spaces is disrespectful. And we need to be acting a little more consciously. We need to be a little more mindful, because those beaches are living, those forests are living. I honor those relatives of the sea and the forest in everything that I do, because I recognize that their genetics is just as old as mine, but they've been here just as long. I really want to thank each and every one of you for joining us in the circle today, for sharing space and time, for being curious enough to engage in this discussion. So Halalt. I'd like to open the floor if anybody has any questions or any comments.
Sorry, jump in. There is a microphone right back there. If you speak in the microphone, it will help. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Happy Earth Day.
Was it Earth Day today?
Well, I mean, every day is Earth Day, but the clams that are produced, you talked about sort of the interplay between the land and the water and food security. And so are clams sort of being in production, but if a bear wants to eat, I mean, how does it work in sort of practicality in terms of harvesting and being sort of shared among and between humans and species? And
So we've got a great plan for that. So a handful of years ago, we had a legacy planning meeting. Because these beaches were closed off to us for a really long time, the production rate was nil. And so as we started to aerate the substrate, well, there's natural spawning that happens. And over the years, what we have found is there's been an increase in biomass and biodiversity. And so this year, what we're going to do is we're going to collect certain species of clams and create seed, grow it to a certain size, and then we're going to go and seed some of these beaches just to see how that beach is going to react a little bit. Some of these spaces, I don't spend a tremendous amount of time in watching the water, watching the tides. I don't know anything really about the undertow. I do know lots about the ferry wake, so I'm concerned about timing of seeding. The grander concept that came from the legacy planning meeting was to actively farm in those spaces. There are 19 collective nations that share those spaces historically, genetically. And so the desire is to be able to harvest and distribute through those nations. Yeah, thank you.
Hello. I was wondering, is this method of clam walls specific to this area, or is this something you could generalize to other places as well?
Fabulous question. It's one of the questions that I get asked most often. So the original rock walls that were found were actually found up island, further up island from where we are. And not only did the Salish have them, but also the Hul'q'umi'num also had them, and I believe even further up as well. And so it's a shared mariculture practice along the coast. And what I imagine is probably relatives got into a canoe and came down and said, oh, wow, look at your clams. How'd you get all of this? And then probably a sharing of capacity and knowledge. Yeah, but we're not the only ones. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it looks like you guys are good. So one of the things that I often get asked quite a bit about before I leave the stage, I'll share just a tiny bit about some things. One of the things I often get asked about is my hat. So this hat was woven by Melody Morrison. She is Haida. The down wefts are red cedar and the rounds are yellow cedar. The other thing that is a bit of a showstopper is my pendant. It's a Thunderbird that was created by a gentleman by the name of Don Lancaster, as well as my earrings. And my vest, comes from the Niska territory. So yeah, but anyway, once again, thank you so much for sharing space and time with me. Haichka, haitzafka.
So thank you for joining us. That was Nicole Norris. If you'd like to talk to her also, she will be out in the Potomac just after this presentation and all day tomorrow. And next up, we'll have at 4:15, Zuni Waffle Gardenings with Reina. So please join us again at 4:15. Thank you.